All right, let's dive in. We've got some really provocative material for this deep dive sent in by you, our listener.
Yeah, this is interesting stuff.
This source is excerpts from an interview with Robert Kiyosaki. He was on the Dad Saves America YouTube channel.
Right.
And look, you probably need to buckle up because the perspective here on money, education, the economy, it's really designed to make you, question things.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, our mission today is really to unpack Kiyosaki's core ideas strictly as he lays them out in this specific interview.
Right, only what's in the source.
Exactly. We're going to look at his pretty sharp critiques of traditional schooling and financial advice.
Yeah.
We'll try to get a handle on his basic ideas about assets versus liabilities, which is fundamental for him, and his take on the whole macroeconomic picture right now.
Think of this as maybe a guided tour through a viewpoint that often feels like it's running completely opposite to mainstream thinking.
Definitely feels that way sometimes.
It's where you might find some of those unexpected aha moments, or maybe just kind of stare blankly and think, wait, what? Let's just see what he says.
Okay, so right out of the gate, Kiyosaki hits on what he sees as the absolute root problem: financial illiteracy.
Okay.
He argues pretty forcefully that the lack of real financial education in schools is just a fundamental failure.
And he doesn't pull any punches about the consequences of that, does he? He makes this really controversial claim.
Oh, yeah.
That this lack of financial smarts means, in his words, idiots are ending up running the government and making, terrible financial decisions for everybody.
He uses his own life story quite a bit to illustrate this. He sets up this contrast. His poor dad, highly educated, PhDs from top schools, but always broke, versus his rich dad, no formal higher education, but incredibly financially successful.
That contrast really seems central to his whole argument about the piece of paper, right?
Exactly.
He seems to dismiss academic degrees, even PhDs, as way less important than actually understanding money.
Yeah, he shares that line from his rich dad. It's memorable. A banker doesn't want your report card. They want to see your financial statement.
Right, your actual numbers.
And based on that, his view of academics can be pretty, harsh. He basically claims they often know jack about money. He even says they can be the worst people on planet Earth, financially speaking, because they value their academic credentials over, the reality of cash flow and balance sheets.
Wow. Okay. Strong words. So let's try and connect that idea, financial understanding or the lack of it, to how he used the intentional economic system. Because this next part, it definitely challenges how most people think about money.
Yeah, he frames the whole modern economy starting from a specific point in time, 1971.
Okay, what happened then?
That's when President Nixon took the U.S. dollar off the gold standard. And Kiyosaki's interpretation is stark. From that moment on, the U.S. dollar became debt. It wasn't backed by gold anymore.
So if the dollar itself is debt, then how does he think money gets created now? It's not people earning salaries in his model.
No, not fundamentally. He argues money is now created primarily by borrowing it into existence. Banks create money when they make loans. And in his view, the entire U.S. economy is built on this foundation of borrowing. He flat out states that if the U.S. stopped borrowing money, the whole system would just collapse.
Which explains why he pushes back so hard against that common advice to live debt-free.
Exactly. He thinks that advice shows complete misunderstanding of how the modern economy actually works. He argues it runs on debt. You need debt.
And looking at now, like 2024, he points to the government printing massive amounts of money.
Yeah, he cites that figure, $1 trillion being printed roughly every 90 days as proof of this deep reliance on debt and borrowing just to keep things afloat. He sees it as incredibly precarious.
He mentioned history too, didn't he? Like Bretton Woods, the Civil War, Greenback, Weimar.
Yeah, yes, exactly. He draws parallels. Bretton Woods was the system before the gold standard link broke. The greenback was fiat money during the U.S. Civil War. And Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe are, classic examples of hyperinflation fueled by printing presses.
And what's the common thread he sees?
His key point is that this pattern, governments printing tons of money, historically leads to the same two outcomes consistently. One, the rich get richer because they own the assets that inflate in price.
Okay.
And two, the poor and the middle class get poor because their wages don't keep up with the rising cost of living.
So why does printing money hit lower-income people the hardest, in his view?
Well, because while the government is printing, sure, asset values might go up, things like houses, stocks.
Right.
But, and this is crucial, the cost of everyday things, food, gas, rent, utilities, also skyrockets. He argues this puts a massive squeeze on anyone earning, say, less than $100,000 a year. It makes essentials harder to afford, pushes homeownership further out of reach, and he links it directly to rising homelessness.
He also rings the alarm bell about demographics, doesn't he? The whole idea of fewer young workers supporting more older people globally.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He sees that demographic shift as a huge looming problem, a pending financial catastrophe. He thinks the speed at which things could unravel, like bankruptcies and economic crises, is about to accelerate dramatically. He uses the phrase, it's going to go fast.
Okay, so the economy runs on debt, printing money hurts the average person, schools don't teach you about money. How does he say you're supposed to navigate all this?
Right, this brings us to what he considers the absolute bedrock, the most fundamental concept that most people just miss.
Which is?
The real difference between an asset and a liability.
And his definitions seem simple, but the way he applies them is where it gets controversial.
Totally. For Kiyosaki, it's dead simple. An asset puts money into your pocket, period.
Yeah.
Whether you work or not.
Okay.
And a liability takes money out of your pocket.
And here comes the big one, the one that throws people off because it goes against everything we're taught.
Yep.
He says your personal home is not an asset.
Correct. According to his definition, your primary residence is a liability. Why? Because it constantly takes money out of your pocket. You've got the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, upkeep, repairs.
Yeah.
It's always costing you money.
Which completely contradicts the American dream idea that your home is your biggest asset.
Directly contradicts it.
Yeah.
He sees it as a major financial misconception.
And he's just as blunt, maybe even more dismissive about common investments, right? Like 401ks, IRAs.
Oh, yeah. Mutual funds, ETFs, stocks, bonds.
Yeah.
He often lumps these together as liabilities, or, his word, garbage.
Garbage. Why?
Specifically garbage for peasants, as he puts it. His reasoning is that these retirement accounts and funds primarily take money from your pocket, your contributions, fees, and give it to the fund managers.
The financial institutions.
The guys like me, the capitalist, is how he phrases it. He says he personally wouldn't touch that garbage.
Okay, so if your house isn't an asset and traditional investments are garbage, what should people focus on then, according to him?
It all boils down to one thing: cash flow.
Cash flow.
That's the absolute key. Does this thing, whatever it is, generate cash that flows into your pocket, or does it cause cash to flow out? That's the only question that matters for his asset liability definition.
And he mentioned earlier what a banker cares about isn't your degree, it's your financial statements.
Exactly. He hammers on the importance of understanding three core documents: the income statement.
Money in versus money out over time.
Right, the balance sheet.
What you own versus what you owe at a point in time.
Yep. And the statement of cash flow, tracking exactly where money is coming from and going. He finds it mind-boggling that schools don't teach this basic financial language.
And that's why he made the board game.
That's what he says. He created the Cash HFLO game specifically to teach these concepts through experience, not just theory. He quotes Maria Montessori, "What the hand does, the mind remembers." He wants people to feel the transactions.
Okay, so Kiyosaki's core message is, the rich don't work for money, they acquire assets. How does he say they actually do that, especially for avoiding traditional routes?
Well, in his framework, it's about building or buying things that spin off positive cash flow. That's the goal.
And critically, he's a big advocate for using debt to achieve this, right? Not avoiding it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
He actively promotes using debt strategically, what he'd call good jet, to buy income-producing assets. He gives a personal story about buying his first condo.
The one on the beach?
Yeah, an expensive property, apparently. He says he bought it using his credit card. Basically, 100% debt financing.
Wow. And his rental properties, the 1,600 units, that's his prime example.
That seems to be his main business illustration, yes. With those rentals, the tenants pay rent. That rent money goes into his pocket. That's the positive cash flow from the asset.
Okay.
And he explicitly mentions these properties are 100% debt financed. He combines this leverage with understanding the tax code very well, structuring things so he pays essentially zero taxes on that rental income.
Which he frames as being financially smart.
Right, and he even connects it back to, like, America's origins in a tax revolt. It's an interesting justification.
His buying strategy also seems totally backward compared to what you usually hear. Buy low, sell high, sure, but his timing.
It's countercyclical. He argues strongly against buying assets when prices are high, when everyone's excited because of FOMO, fear of missing out.
He calls them lemmings.
Yeah, following the crowd off the cliff. Instead, he says he buys aggressively during market crashes, when prices have plummeted and everyone else is panicking.
Like in 2008.
He cites that specifically, borrowing $300 million during the 2008 financial crisis to scoop up real estate on the cheap. That's his strategy.
He also mentions using more complex things like derivatives.
Yes, he says he understands and uses derivatives, which he describes in this interview simply as packaged debt. He uses them for profit.
Isn't that what Warren Buffett called weapons of mass financial destruction?
He acknowledges that exact quote from Buffett. He knows they're risky and complex, but he sees it as part of the game. He also views big fund managers, like at BlackRock, as essentially packaging up what he considers garbage assets into complex products.
Okay, moving beyond just the financial nuts and bolts, Kiyosaki also talks quite a bit about mindset, different kinds of intelligence, and his observations on society.
He does. He stresses developing multiple intelligences, not just the academic kind. He talks about mental, physical, spiritual, and crucially, emotional intelligence, or EQ.
And he loops this back to his critique of schools.
Right. His view is that traditional schools focus almost exclusively on mental intelligence, and maybe worse, they punish mistakes.
Why is punishing mistakes such a big deal for him? It sounds counterintuitive, maybe.
Because he fundamentally believes that making mistakes is how you learn. It's how you get smarter, especially in the real world.
Like learning to ride a bike.
Exactly. Or a baby learning to walk. They fall down constantly, but that's the process. He thinks schools, by penalizing errors, instill fear and actually stop people from trying things, from learning effectively, from adapting.
So, if traditional schools are flawed, who should you learn from, according to Kiyosaki?
He says you need to seek out the best teachers. But for him, that means finding people who are actually doing the thing you want to learn, successfully doing it.
Not just academics talking about it.
Precisely. Not necessarily people with fancy degrees teaching theory. He talks about how he found his own rich dad by actively looking for a mentor who was succeeding in business.
And he mentioned YouTube.
Yeah, he sees platforms like YouTube as potential sources of many teachers now, but he adds a caution. There are good ones and bad ones, and you have to be able to tell the difference.
Which leads to the obvious question, how do you spot the fakes, the scams?
His advice there is pretty straightforward, almost cliche, but maybe true. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Especially the get-rich-quick stuff.
Definitely. He warns against being taken in by slick marketing or people who just look wealthy. You need to dig deeper.
He also seems to frame a lot of the current economic and social debates through a specific lens, capitalism versus Marxism.
Yes, he sees that as a fundamental conflict playing out.
How does he articulate that?
He points to ideas from Marx's Communist Manifesto, things like abolishing private property, workers uniting through unions, and sees them as core tenets for spreading communism.
He told a story about that, didn't he? With his dad's.
Yeah, a personal one. His poor dad, the academic, called him a scab when he was young for crossing a picket line to work for his rich dad during a strike. For Kiyosaki, that moment really highlighted the deep ideological divide he grew up between.
And he thinks that divide, or maybe that resentment towards business, still exists.
He observes what he calls a historical and ongoing resentment in academia towards the rich and the merchant or capitalist class. He sees it as a fundamental difference in values.
He also mentioned a lesson from military school that stuck with him.
Watch what people do, not just what they say.
Right. Actions speak louder than words.
And he says he applies that lens to politics. This leads into some of his more, let's say, politically charged interpretations in the interview.
Such as, what kind of actions is he interpreting?
Well, he looks at specific government policy decisions he mentioned, cutting the Keystone XL pipeline, or policies related to border security, and interprets them not through the usual Republican versus Democrat debate, but through his lens of potential Marxist goals. He speculates, for instance, that actions raising the cost of living might be intended to create class division, or that weakening border security could be aimed at undermining the nation-state itself.
So, important to stress here. This is strictly his interpretation presented in the source. We're just relaying his viewpoint.
Absolutely. It's a very specific and highly controversial political reading of events.
He also brought up fatherlessness, connecting it to the show he was on.
Yeah, he mentioned this statistic, 1 in 4 kids in America growing up without a father figure. He stresses how vital fathers are, tying it into the Dad Saves America theme. He feels he personally was doubly rich because he had 2 strong father figures in his life, his biological poor dad and his mentor, rich dad.
And he touched on his Vietnam experience, too. That sounded intense.
Very. He talked about the kinds of intelligence needed in combat, mental, emotional, spiritual systems, especially when facing death, seeing friends die. He also shared how difficult it was coming home to anti-war protests, being called names like baby killer.
But he mentioned his commander's view.
Yeah, that his commander told them they fought precisely for the right of those people back home to protest, even against them. A complex perspective.
Okay, so let's wrap up with his own story a bit, getting his book out there and what he says his mission is now.
He talks about the struggle initially to get Rich Dad, Poor Dad published.
Why was it tough?
Because, he says, the ideas flew in the face of conventional thinking, especially the academic and publishing world's views on finance and education. They rejected it.
So he self-published.
He did. And then, interestingly, it started gaining traction organically, particularly through the Amway network marketing community.
And then the Oprah call happened.
Right. He mentions getting the call from Oprah Winfrey's producers, which, as you can imagine, completely changed the game and made the book a global phenomenon.
And now, what's his focus today, according to this interview?
He states his current mission is actually starting his own network marketing system. The stated goal is to teach capitalism and its financial principles on a global scale through that model.
Okay, so that was quite a tour through Robert Kiyosaki's perspective, based purely on that Dad Saves America interview footage we reviewed.
Definitely. We've covered some pretty challenging, even jarring ideas. You know, the whole your house is not an asset thing.
Yeah, that's a big one. And his dismissal of 401ks and traditional investments as garbage.
And his very positive view on using debt strategically to build wealth. It's a very different framework.
And again, just to reiterate, we've aimed to simply present his views as he stated them in that specific source material.
Exactly. Not endorsing, not refuting, just unpacking what was said.
Yeah.
His perspective is certainly designed to shake things up and make you question conventional financial wisdom.
So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on, building directly on what we've heard today. Kiyosaki makes this bold claim that formal education doesn't just fail to teach financial literacy, but it might actually be designed to produce employees and debtors, not capitalists or financially independent people.
Oh, yeah.
So if you take that perspective seriously, even just as a thought experiment, how might you reconsider where, and maybe more importantly, who, you seek out for your own financial education outside of those traditional channels?